The late summer heat baked the dusty ground of the county auction yard, pressing down on the shoulders of the men who stood with their arms crossed, hats tipped low against the glare. It was a weight they were used to, a familiar oppression that settled in the bones right alongside the price of feed and the threat of drought. The air was thick with the smells of manure, dry grass, and cheap coffee, a perfume of rural commerce that had not changed in 100 years. Elias stood apart from the low murmur of the crowd, his shadow a long, still shape against the weathered wood of the holding pens. He had not come to buy. He had not bought anything in a decade. He came for the noise, for the motion, for any sensation that might briefly push back the dense, suffocating silence that had filled his life since the day the world went quiet. His ranch, once a place of purpose, now lay fallow under the same sun, its fences sagging like tired shoulders, its fields whispering with neglect. He was a man carved from stillness, his face a landscape of sun-weathered lines that spoke of a grief so old it had become part of his bones. His hands, calloused and capable, hung limp at his sides. They were hands that knew the feel of a newborn calf, the heft of a post-hole digger, the gentle curve of a woman's waist. Now, they mostly just remembered. The auctioneer's voice, a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, was the heartbeat of the day. Lot after lot passed through the central ring, cattle with rolling, suspicious eyes, pens of nervous sheep, a tired-looking quarter horse with a good lineage and bad knees. The bids were clipped, knowing. Men nodded, raised a finger, communicated fortunes in a language of spare gestures. Elias watched without seeing, the familiar ritual washing over him like a tide that could no longer reach the high, barren ground where he lived. Then, the rhythm broke. The heavy gate creaked open and a man, not one of the usual ranch hands, led a single animal into the ring. It was a goat, a doe with a coat the color of old cream and eyes like dark, polished amber. She was not remarkable, not a creature of high breeding or particular value. But there was something else. Clinging to the goat's side, her small hand tangled in its coarse hair, was a little girl. A hush fell over the assembled bidders. The girl could not have been more than 8 or 9, her frame as thin and fragile as a bird's. Her face was smudged with dirt, a pale oval dominated by wide, vacant eyes that seemed to look at everything and see nothing. She moved as if she were a part of the animal, her steps matching the goat's, her small body pressed to its flank for warmth against a chill no one else could feel. The auctioneer, a portly man named Henderson whose confidence was his stock in trade, looked flustered for the first time all day. He cleared his throat, adjusting his microphone. "Folks, we have an unusual situation here. This young lady was found over by the highway. Sheriff's been called. Doesn't say a word. Just her and this goat." Sheriff Brody stood near the entrance, his arms crossed. He was a man whose patience had been worn smooth over 40 years of service. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent confirmation that he had no answers either. The girl was a ghost who had simply appeared at the edge of their world. "The girl is a ward of the state for now," Henderson continued, trying to regain his footing. "But the animal is property. Unclaimed. We'll start the bidding at $20 to cover the trouble. A good goat. Healthy," his words were hollow, an attempt to force the bizarre spectacle back into the comfortable box of commerce. A few men chuckled uneasily. Others just shook their heads. Who would buy a single goat tied to such a strange and sorrowful mystery? The girl's silence was an accusation, a heavy presence in the hot, dusty air. She was a problem someone else would have to solve. Henderson called for a bid. Once. Twice. The silence that answered was profound. It was the silence of men who knew when to look away, when to let a bad situation lie. And then, a sound. A single, sharp scrape of a boot on gravel. Elias moved. He stepped forward from the shadows of the holding pens, out into the unforgiving sunlight. He had not moved with such purpose in years. His eyes were not on the auctioneer, not on the shuffling, uncomfortable crowd. They were fixed on the goat. And in that moment, he saw it. A glint of something small and metallic, half hidden in the rough fur beneath the animal's ear. A tiny, tarnished bell on a worn leather collar. A memory, sharp and brutal, pierced the fog of his existence. A little girl's laughter. The high, tinkling sound of a silver bell. A promise broken. A lie told to a child to spare her a pain that was nothing compared to the pain that would follow. 50, Elias said. His voice was rough, a tool rusted from disuse. Every head turned. The word hung in the air, impossibly loud. Elias, the ghost of the valley, had spoken. He had made a bid. The crowd stared, their curiosity a palpable force. Henderson blinked, surprised. I have $50. Do I hear 60? No one moved. No one breathed. The drama had shifted. It was no longer about a lost girl and her goat. It was about Elias. Sold, Henderson said, slamming his gavel down with a crack that made the girl flinch. To Elias. Without a word, Elias walked past the auctioneer's block, past the stunned faces of his neighbors, and into the ring. The dust puffed up around his worn boots. He did not look at the girl, not at first. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and held out a hand to the goat. The animal watched him for a long moment with its unervingly intelligent eyes. Then it stepped forward and nudged his palm, a gesture of quiet trust. Only then did Elias raise his eyes to the child. Her face was a blank mask of trauma, but as he met her gaze, he saw something flicker deep within the vacancy. A spark of recognition. Not of him, but of the kindness he offered her animal. She did not recoil when he slowly reached out and took the frayed rope from the handler's hand. He stood, the rope held loosely in his scarred fingers. He gave a slight, questioning tug. The goat followed. And attached to the goat, the girl followed too. A strange, silent trinity, they walked out of the auction ring, away from the murmurings of the crowd, leaving behind a silence filled with a decade of unspoken questions that had suddenly, inexplicably, found a voice. Sheriff Brody watched them go, his expression unreadable, but he made no move to stop them. He knew grief when he saw it, and he knew that sometimes it moved in ways that law and logic could not explain. The journey back to the ranch was a procession of quietude. Elias's old truck groaned and rattled, its engine a noisy counterpoint to the absolute stillness within the cab. The girl sat pressed against the passenger door, as far from him as she could get, her small form rigid. The goat rode in the truck bed, its silhouette occasionally visible in the rearview mirror, a steady presence watching the road unspool behind them. Elias's property greeted them with the same weary indifference it showed every day. The gate hung on one hinge. Weeds choked the path to the house. The barn, a great, silvered structure that had been his father's pride, sagged under the weight of time and emptiness. It was a place where memories had been left to die, and the dust that covered everything was the dust of their decay. He bypassed the house, leading them instead to the barn's deep, cool interior. Sunlight slanted through the gaps in the wallboards, striping the hay-strewn floor in bars of gold and shadow. The air smelled of old hay, leather, and earth. It was the only place that still felt remotely like home. He led the goat into a large stall, one that had once housed a proud mare named Blue. The wood of the stall was smooth, worn down by generations of animal life. He poured fresh water into a stone trough and forked a pile of clean hay into the corner. The girl watched his every move, her silence a heavy cloak. She stood just inside the barn door, a small, lost soul caught between the harsh light outside and the deep shadows within. When the goat was settled, Elias turned to her. He didn't speak. Words were useless things, clumsy and inadequate for the space that now existed between them. He simply gestured toward a low stool in the corner, an invitation. She hesitated, her gaze darting from his face to the goat and back again. The goat, content, let out a low bleat. It was this sound, this simple, animal reassurance, that seemed to decide for her. She moved with a shuffling slowness and sat on the very edge of the stool, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her back ramrod straight. Elias left the barn doors open and went about his chores, the slow, familiar tasks he'd performed on autopilot for years. He repaired a section of fence, his movements economical and sure. He cleared a clogged irrigation ditch. All the while, he was aware of the two beings in his barn. A current of life, faint but undeniable, had been introduced into his stagnant world. It was unsettling. It was terrifying. It was, he admitted to a part of himself he thought long dead, the first thing he had felt besides the dull ache of loss in a very long time. Late in the afternoon, Martha, the town veterinarian, pulled up in her dusty pickup. Her arrival was not a surprise. News in a valley this small traveled faster than wildfire. She got out, a woman whose calm competence was a comfort to man and beast alike. Her own husband had been gone 5 years, and she wore her widowhood not as a shroud, but as a quiet source of strength. She understood the geographies of grief. "Elias," she said, her voice gentle. "Brody called me. Said you bought yourself a goat." Elias just nodded, leaning against the fence post he'd just set. Seemed like the thing to do. He also mentioned the goat came with company. He gestured toward the barn. Martha walked past him, her boots making soft sounds in the dirt. She paused at the entrance, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She saw the girl on the stool, a small, tense statue, and the goat munching hay. She saw the clean water and the fresh bedding. She took it all in without a word. Martha did not approach the child. Instead, she entered the stall and ran a professional hand over the goat's back and flanks. The goat allowed the inspection, chewing placidly. "She's in good health," Martha said, her voice pitched to carry to Elias but not startle the girl. "A little thin, but strong. She's been well cared for." As she finished her quiet examination, her fingers brushed against the goat's collar. She paused, her brow furrowing slightly as she looked closer at the small, tarnished bell. It was old, the kind of simple trinket a child might treasure. She glanced from the bell to the silent girl, then back out to where Elias stood, silhouetted against the setting sun. A connection was being made, a thread being pulled, but she did not yet know what it was weaving. Later that night, long after Martha had left, Elias sat on his porch, watching the stars emerge in the deep indigo sky. The house behind him was dark. He had not offered the girl a place inside, and she had not sought one. She remained in the barn, a silent vigil with her only companion. He had left a plate of food and a glass of milk on the stool, which had been untouched when he checked an hour ago. The night was filled with the familiar sounds of crickets and the low sigh of the wind through the dry grass. But tonight, there was another sound, carried on the breeze from the barn. A faint, intermittent tinkling. The sound of the tiny silver bell. Each chime was a key turning a lock deep inside him. He closed his eyes, and the memory he had fought all afternoon returned with punishing clarity. It was his daughter, Lily, 7 years old, her face bright with joy as she fastened that very collar around the neck of her own goat, a gift for her birthday. He remembered the feel of her small hand in his as he helped her buckle the leather. He remembered the pride in her eyes. He also remembered the lie, the gut-wrenching decision a week before the accident to sell the goat. A man had offered a ridiculous sum, money they had desperately needed. A man with a polished car and a cold smile who said it was for his granddaughter. Elias had told Lily her goat had run away, that they would find it. He had manufactured a story to shield her from a harsh, adult reality, a small betrayal he intended to confess and atone for someday. But someday never came. The lie became the last secret he ever kept from her, a toxic, festering wound. He opened his eyes, the stars blurring through a film of moisture. It couldn't be. The goat, Lily's goat, was supposed to have been in the trailer with them, the one found crushed and empty at the crash site. That was the story. That was the official record. But his senses, the ones he had trusted his entire life, told him otherwise. The way this goat moved, the way it had nudged his hand, the undeniable presence of that bell, it was the same animal. If this was Lily's goat, then the official story was wrong. And if that was wrong, what else was? A cold dread, colder than any grief he had ever known, began to seep into his veins. The girl in his barn was not just a random stray. She was a message, and the past was not buried. It was here, in his barn, chewing hay in the darkness, waiting for him. The need for answers was a physical thirst. Elias felt it pull him from his bed before the sun had even hinted at its return. The house was cold, a museum of a life that was no longer his. He bypassed the kitchen, the living room, every space haunted by the ghosts of laughter and conversation. He climbed the stairs to the one place he had not entered in 10 years, the attic. The air that met him at the top of the stairs was thick and still, tasting of old paper and cedar. A single, grimy window let in a weak, gray light, illuminating a world draped in white sheets, a landscape of forgotten furniture and sealed boxes. This was the tomb he had made for his family's possessions, the things too painful to look at, too precious to discard. He moved with a hesitant reverence, his boots stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the pale light. He knew what he was looking for. He made his way to a far corner, to a large, wooden toy chest with Lily's name painted on the lid in cheerful, looping letters, now faded and peeling. His hand trembled as he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, the scent of his daughter's childhood rushed up to meet him. Faded drawings of crooked houses and smiling suns. A doll with yarn hair. A collection of smooth, gray river stones. And there, at the bottom, nestled in a fold of a baby blanket, was a small, coiled loop of leather. It was a collar, one he had made himself. It was identical to the one on the goat in his barn, but for one crucial difference. The small ring where the bell should have been was empty. He remembered the day it broke. Lily had come to him in tears, the tiny silver bell clutched in her fist, the loop on its top having snapped. He had promised to fix it, taking the bell and putting it in the small tin box on his workbench where he kept screws and nails and other small things to be mended. A few days later, before he'd had a chance to fix the collar, the man named Sterling had come. He had sold the goat, and in his guilt and haste, he had forgotten all about the bell. The accident happened a week after that. In the chaotic aftermath, amidst the reports and the soul-crushing logistics of death, the detail of the goat had become confused. He'd been numb, barely coherent. He must have said it was with them. The authorities, seeing no reason to question a grieving father over a missing animal, had simply noted it down. It became fact. Elias sank back on his heels, the empty collar clutched in his hand. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had not sold Lily's goat. He had sold a goat. The bell, her bell, had remained in the tin on his workbench. He must have, at some point, put it on the new collar and given it back to her for another animal, or perhaps she'd put it on the collar of the goat he sold before it left. His memory of those last days was a fog of sorrow and regret. But the proof was here. The goat in his barn was, impossibly, Lily's goat. He stumbled down the attic stairs, his mind reeling. He went not to the house, but to the workshop, a small shed adjoining the barn. Dust lay thick on every surface, but the small tin box was still on the workbench, right where he had left it a decade ago. He lifted the lid. It was filled with old screws, washers, a few bent nails, but it was empty of any bell. The truth struck him then with the force of a physical blow. He had not kept the bell. He had fixed it. He had attached it to the collar right before Sterling took the goat away. He remembered now, a flash of memory breaking through the haze. Lily had insisted. She wanted the man's granddaughter to have the bell. It was a gift, a gesture of childlike generosity that he, in his adult shame, had completely buried. He walked slowly to the barn. The girl was asleep in the hay, curled near the goat's warm body, her face peaceful for the first time. The goat watched him approach, its jaw moving in a slow, rhythmic grind. Elias knelt beside it, his movements careful so as not to wake the child. His hand, steady now, reached for the collar. He felt the worn leather, the tarnished silver. And there, scratched into the bell's surface by his own hand all those years ago, so faint it was almost invisible, was a single, tiny letter. L. For Lily. This animal was a direct, living link to the last days of his daughter's life. And this silent, traumatized child had brought it back to him. The question was no longer just how, but why. Who was this girl? And what did she have to do with the cold, wealthy man who had driven away with his daughter's goat 10 years ago? The coincidence was too great, the connection too profound to be an accident. This was a reckoning. The answer to his unspoken question arrived the next afternoon, announcing itself with the crunch of expensive tires on his neglected gravel drive. A sleek black sedan, so clean it seemed to repel the dust of the valley, rolled to a stop in front of the house. It was a vehicle from another world, a world of money and power that had no place here. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a crisp shirt and tailored trousers, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. His face was handsome in a severe, controlled way, but his eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. Elias recognized him instantly. It was Richard Sterling. He looked older, but the air of ruthless entitlement that clung to him was unchanged. Elias had been mending a harness on the porch. He set his tools down slowly, his body tensing. He did not stand. He watched as Sterling approached the porch steps, his polished shoes looking obscene in the dirt. "Elias," Sterling said. It was not a question. His voice was smooth, accustomed to command. "It has been a long time." "Sterling," Elias replied, his own voice flat and hard as stone. "I heard about the disturbance at the auction," Sterling continued, ignoring the frost in the air between them. "I've come for my granddaughter. And my property." He gestured vaguely toward the barn. "I understand you have both." Elias's blood ran cold. Granddaughter. The word was a key, unlocking a door to a dark room he now had to enter. "The girl is with you." "Of course she is with me. She is my blood," Sterling said, a flicker of irritation in his tone. "Her name is Anna. She's been unwell since her parents passed. She has these episodes. She wanders. I have her legal custody papers right here." He tapped a sleek leather briefcase at his side. "I'm here to take her back, where she can be properly cared for, in a facility that understands her needs." The words were smooth, reasonable, but the meaning beneath them was monstrous. A facility. A place to keep her quiet. A place to hide her. In the barn, the goat let out a sudden, agitated bleat, as if sensing the predator that had just arrived. "And the goat?" Elias asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A sentimental animal," Sterling said with a dismissive wave. "It belonged to her mother. She's overly attached. It's not healthy. It will be dealt with." Just then, two more vehicles pulled into the drive. The first was Sheriff Brody's patrol car, dust billowing behind it. The second was Martha's truck. They had seen Sterling's car pass through town, a shark in a fish pond, and had followed their instincts. They got out and walked toward the porch, their faces grim. They flanked Elias, not behind him, but beside him, a small, silent wall of defiance. Brody tipped his hat. "Sterling, what brings you all the way out here?" "Sheriff," Sterling acknowledged with a tight, unpleasant smile. "I'm simply retrieving my granddaughter. This man," he nodded at Elias, "interfered. I'm sure he meant well, but the child is vulnerable, unstable. I question his judgment in bringing her to a place like this." The threat was clear, wrapped in a silken sheath of concern. He was painting Elias as a danger, a broken man taking advantage of a helpless child. Martha stepped forward slightly. "The girl seems to have made a choice. She seems to feel safe here. She is a child, a traumatized child. She doesn't know what's good for her," Sterling snapped, his composure finally cracking. "I have the law on my side. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm taking my granddaughter." He made to step past them, to walk toward the barn. Elias rose to his feet, a silent, unmovable object in his path. The air crackled with tension. The standoff had begun. The past was no longer a memory. It was here, on his porch, demanding to claim the future. As if on cue, the sky, which had been a clear, hard blue all day, began to darken. A wind kicked up from the west, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. It whipped dust into eddies around their feet and rattled the loose tin on the barn roof. A storm was coming. The barn became the stage for the final act. Sterling, his patience exhausted, strode toward it, his steps clipped and angry. "This is absurd. I am her legal guardian." Elias, Brody, and Martha followed, a grim procession. They entered the barn's cathedral of shadows just as the first fat drops of rain began to strike the roof like scattered pebbles. The girl, Anna, was huddled in the stall, her arms wrapped around the goat's neck, her face buried in its flank. She was trembling. "Anna," Sterling commanded, his voice sharp, devoid of any warmth. "Come here." Now, the girl did not move. She only pressed herself tighter against the animal. "I will not have this melodrama," Sterling hissed. He reached over the stall door, his hand a claw, and grabbed for the girl's arm. A sound tore from the girl's throat. It was not a word, but a raw, guttural sob of pure terror, a sound that had been locked away in silence for a year. At that moment, two things happened at once. The storm broke in earnest, a torrent of rain drumming a deafening roar on the roof. And the goat moved. With a swift, powerful movement, the animal stepped directly between the girl and Sterling's reaching hand. It planted its feet, lowered its head, and stood its ground. It did not make a sound. It did not need to. The act was one of absolute, unwavering protection. It was a choice, made in the language of loyalty that knows no words. It had chosen the broken man over the wealthy one. It had chosen the sanctuary over the prison. Anna, freed from Sterling's grasp, scrambled away and clung to Elias's leg, burying her face against the rough denim of his jeans. Her small body shook with silent, racking sobs. Sterling stared, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. His power, the power of money and legal documents and intimidation, had just been nullified by a farm animal. It was then that Sheriff Brody spoke, his voice calm and steady against the roar of the rain. "Sterling, I got a call from a colleague back east while you were driving out here. Did some checking. It's funny, the things you can find when you know what to look for." Sterling turned slowly to face him, his eyes narrowing. "Your son and his wife," Brody continued, his gaze level and hard. "And his parents. They died in a house fire about a year ago. It was ruled an accident. But you were the sole beneficiary of a very, very large insurance policy on their estate. A policy you took out just 2 months before the fire." The color drained from Sterling's face. "The only other witness to the fire was Anna," Brody said, his voice dropping. "A little girl who mysteriously stopped speaking right after it happened. A little girl you've kept isolated, hidden away, ever since. It almost seems like you were afraid of what she might say, if she ever found her voice again." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, ugly and horrifying. The girl's mother had been Sterling's granddaughter, the one for whom he had bought the goat all those years ago. The animal was the girl's last living link to the mother she had lost, her only comfort in a world of terror. Sterling hadn't been caring for his granddaughter. He had been holding her captive, silencing her to protect his monstrous secret. The auction, her escape, it was a loose end he had come here to tie up for good. "That's a vile accusation," Sterling stammered, but the authority was gone from his voice. It was hollow, brittle. "Is it?" Brody asked softly. "I think you and I need to have a long talk down at the station. A very long talk." He gestured to the barn door, a silent, final command. The storm of Sterling's power had broken, defeated not by a weapon, but by the quiet truth and the fierce, silent love of a girl for her goat. His polished facade crumbled, revealing the rotten core beneath. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the barn into the cleansing rain, a man stripped of everything but his guilt. Brody followed, leaving Elias and Martha standing in the sudden, ringing silence. The rain softened, its roar diminishing to a steady, gentle drumming on the roof. The fury of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. Inside the barn, the tension finally broke. Elias slowly knelt, his joints creaking, until he was on eye level with the small child still clinging to his leg. He didn't speak. He simply placed a hand, large and calloused, on her trembling shoulder. It was a gesture of pure, unvarnished comfort. He looked from the girl to the goat, the animal that had been a vessel for so much pain and so much memory. He reached out and let his fingers rest on the tiny, tarnished bell. L for Lily. A gift of kindness from one child to another, a thread of light that had stretched across a decade of darkness to lead this lost soul to his door. All the grief he had walled up, all the guilt he had carried for the lie, for surviving, for the years of numbness, it all crested within him. He did not make a sound, but a single, hot tear escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the dust and grime on his weathered cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. A surrender, the quiet, profound acknowledgement of a pain that could finally, after 10 long years, begin to heal. Time began to flow again on Elias's ranch. The oppressive stillness of late summer gave way to the soft, golden light of autumn. The change was visible not just in the turning leaves of the cottonwoods along the creek, but in the land itself. Fences that had sagged for years now stood straight and taut. The overgrown path to the house was cleared, and near the porch, a small, tilled patch of earth held the promise of a winter garden. The silence was still there, but it was different now. It was a peaceful silence, no longer heavy with absence, but full of quiet potential. Elias had found a new purpose, or perhaps, an old one had found him again. His work was no longer a mindless repetition of chores, but a deliberate act of care. The ranch was slowly transforming. In the pasture adjoining the barn, 2 rescued horses, deemed too old to be useful, now grazed peacefully. A 3-legged dog, a stray from town, now slept on the porch. The barn, once a monument to loss, had become a sanctuary. He was healing the broken things, and in doing so, he was mending the broken pieces of himself. He and the girl, Anna, had built a life from the quiet spaces between words. She remained in his care, a ward of the state placed in his temporary custody with the strong recommendation of Sheriff Brody and Martha. The legal battles ahead would be long, but for now, she was safe. She still rarely spoke, but her eyes were no longer vacant. They were clear and watchful, taking in the world around her with a slow, dawning curiosity. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, they sat together on the porch steps. It had become their ritual. Elias would clean a piece of tack or whittle a piece of wood, and Anna would draw in the dust with a stick. The goat, whose name they both knew was Daisy, a fact Anna had written in the dirt one afternoon, rested its head contentedly in her lap. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. An unconventional family, formed from the wreckage of two separate tragedies, sat in comfortable silence. Elias looked at the girl, at the way the setting sun caught the gold in her hair, and he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a feeling he thought he would never know again. Anna finished her drawing, a lopsided picture of a goat with a bell around its neck. She looked at it for a long moment, then looked up at Elias. Her expression was serious, her gaze direct. She opened her mouth, and a small, quiet sound emerged, a word spoken with deliberate care, as if testing its weight in the air. "Elias," she whispered. It was the first time she had said his name. He stopped his work, his hands going still. He did not look at her right away, savoring the sound of it, the simple, profound connection it represented. He finally turned his head and met her gaze. A slow, gentle smile, the first true smile in a decade, touched his lips and reached his eyes. He gave a single, slow nod. A promise, an acceptance, a new chapter, written not in sorrow, but in hope, had finally, quietly, begun.